The wind off Massachusetts Bay carries salt and the smell of tilled earth, sweeping across a modest farmhouse in the parish of Braintree on a clear October morning in 1735. Inside, a child has just been born who will, in the span of a single lifetime, witness the birth of a nation and help write the words that bring it into being. His name is John Adams, and though no one standing in that farmhouse could possibly know it, the squalling infant in his mother's arms will one day stand among the handful of men history credits with inventing the United States of America. The world into which John Adams was born was not yet American in any sense we would recognize. It was British. Massachusetts was a colony of the British Crown, its people subjects of King George II, its laws derived from English common law, its loyalties presumed to lie with a monarch 3,000 miles across the Atlantic. The town of Braintree itself was a farming community south of Boston, a place of rocky New England soil, Congregationalist meeting houses, and the rhythms of agricultural life. It was here, in this unassuming corner of the British Empire, that the seeds of revolution would be planted in the character of a single, stubborn, brilliant boy. John Adams was the eldest of three sons born to John Adams Sr. and Susanna Boylston Adams. The father was a man of modest means but considerable standing in the community, a farmer, yes, but also a cordwainer, a shoemaker by trade, and beyond that, a deacon of the church and a selectman of the town. In the tightly woven fabric of colonial New England society, these were not small distinctions. To be a selectman was to be entrusted with the genuine business of self-governance, the town meetings where local matters were debated and decided by the consent of the community. Young John would grow up watching his father participate in this most fundamental form of democracy, a town governing itself through reasoned discourse and majority will. It was a lesson absorbed long before it could be articulated, and it would shape everything that followed. His mother, Susanna, came from the Boylston family, a lineage of some prominence in Massachusetts, connected to men of medicine and learning. From his parents, John Adams inherited two things that would define his life: a fierce, almost combustible intelligence, and a New England Puritan conscience that demanded rigorous self-examination and moral seriousness in equal measure. He was, from childhood, a boy who felt things intensely: pride, frustration, ambition, and doubt, and who would spend much of his life locked in conversation with himself, a habit immortalized in the diaries he kept from adolescence until nearly his death. As a boy, Adams did not take naturally to formal schooling. He found the dry Latin grammar and rote memorization of his early education tedious beyond endurance. He preferred, by his own later admission, to spend his days outdoors, hunting, fishing, flying kites, engaging in the rough sports of farm boys rather than bending over a book. His father, who had ambitions for his eldest son to attend Harvard College and enter the ministry, grew concerned. The story Adams told in later years, perhaps polished by the passage of time, was that his father confronted him about his reluctance to study, and the young John declared that he would rather be a farmer than endure another day under his unsatisfying schoolmaster. His father, in a moment of pragmatic testing, sent him to work the fields the very next day, hoping the physical exhaustion of farm labor would cure the boy's resistance to academic life. But John Adams took to the work with stubborn relish, declaring at the end of the day that he liked farming very well. It was not until his father, somewhat exasperated, allowed him to change schools and study under a more inspiring teacher that something shifted. The new instructor kindled in young Adams a genuine love of learning, and within a year he had progressed enough to be admitted to Harvard College at the age of 15. Harvard in the 1750s was a small institution by modern standards, but it was the intellectual center of New England, training the colony's ministers, lawyers, and statesmen. It was here that Adams's mind, already restless and probing, found real nourishment. He immersed himself in classical literature, in the works of Cicero and the Roman historians, in natural philosophy, in logic and rhetoric. He read law and political theory alongside theology, and though his father still hoped he might enter the ministry, John Adams found himself increasingly drawn elsewhere. He had doubts, the kind of doubts a serious young mind develops when it begins to examine inherited certainties too closely. He questioned the rigid Calvinist theology of his upbringing, troubled by doctrines of predestination and innate depravity that seemed to him to sit uneasily with reason and with the character of a just God. These were not abstract intellectual exercises for Adams. He wrestled with such questions as matters of genuine personal consequence, recording his struggles in the pages of journals that reveal a young man determined to think his way to truth rather than simply inherit it. By the time he graduated from Harvard in 1755, at not yet 20 years of age, Adams had concluded that the pulpit was not his calling. The ministry demanded a certainty of doctrine that his searching, skeptical intellect could not honestly provide. Instead, after a period teaching school in Worcester, Massachusetts, a town he found provincial and uninspiring, a place he privately complained offered little intellectual companionship, Adams turned toward the law. It was while teaching in Worcester that he began to read law under a local attorney. And it was here, in the long hours spent parsing legal texts and observing courtroom proceedings, that he discovered a vocation that married his love of argument, his moral seriousness, and his ambition for distinction. The law in colonial America was not yet the standardized profession it would become. There were no law schools in the modern sense. Young men read law as apprentices, absorbing the vast and tangled inheritance of English common law under the tutelage of an established attorney, copying writs, observing trials, and slowly building the knowledge and the local reputation necessary to be admitted to practice before the courts. Adams pursued this course with characteristic intensity. He was, even then, a man acutely aware of his own ambitions, recording in his diary his hopes for conspicuous achievement, his fears of mediocrity, his determination to make a name that history would remember. This was not idle vanity. Adams genuinely believed, in the Puritan tradition that shaped him, that a man's talents were a trust to be used in service of the public good, and that to waste them in obscurity was itself a kind of moral failure. He returned to Braintree to begin his legal career, and in 1758 was admitted to the bar. The early years of practice were lean. Massachusetts already had established attorneys with reputations and client bases built over decades, and a young, untested lawyer from a farming family had to build his practice case by case, town by town, riding the legal circuit between rural courts to scrape together the experience and income a legal career required. Adams was diligent, exacting, sometimes prickly in his perfectionism, and deeply self-critical in his diary entries about cases lost or arguments poorly made. But slowly, through sheer persistence and a genuine gift for legal reasoning, his reputation began to grow. It was during these years of early professional struggle that John Adams's personal life took the turn that would prove, by his own later estimation, to be the single most fortunate event of his existence. He met Abigail Smith. Abigail was the daughter of a Congregationalist minister in the neighboring town of Weymouth, a young woman of remarkable intelligence who, like so many women of her era, had been denied formal schooling but had nonetheless educated herself voraciously through her father's library and her own determined curiosity. She read widely in literature, history, and political philosophy, and possessed a wit as sharp as Adams's own, along with an emotional steadiness that complemented his more volatile temperament. Their courtship developed through visits and an extraordinary correspondence, letters exchanged that revealed two minds testing and delighting in each other, full of literary allusion, gentle teasing, and increasingly evident affection. Adams, who could be impatient and severe in his judgments of others, found in Abigail an intellectual equal whose opinions he genuinely respected, a rarity for a man of his time and temperament. They married in October of 1764, when Adams was 28 years old. It would prove to be a partnership of extraordinary depth, one that would weather years of forced separation, war, financial uncertainty, and the immense burdens of public life. Abigail Adams was not a passive wife in the conventional 18th-century mold. She would become her husband's most trusted political confidant, a shrewd manager of the family's farm and finances during his long absences, and in the letters they exchanged across the years and across oceans, a voice of conscience, encouragement, and unflinching honesty that shaped Adams's thinking on matters as significant as the rights of women and the moral questions surrounding the new nation's experiment in liberty. Their marriage would produce 6 children, though not all would survive to adulthood, and it would anchor John Adams through the storms to come. The years immediately following his marriage saw John Adams's legal career finally gain real traction, even as the political climate of the colonies began to shift beneath his feet in ways that would soon make the practice of ordinary law impossible to separate from the great constitutional questions of the age. In 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, a measure that would prove to be the spark igniting more than a decade of escalating conflict between Britain and her American colonies. The Stamp Act was, on its surface, a modest piece of fiscal legislation. It required that virtually all printed materials in the colonies, newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, even diplomas, bear an official stamp, purchased from royal agents, with the revenue going to help fund the defense of the colonies following the enormously expensive 7 Years' War. To Parliament, this seemed reasonable enough. The war had been fought partly in defense of the American colonies, after all, and someone had to pay for the soldiers and the debt. But to the colonists, and particularly to colonial lawyers like John Adams who understood intimately the constitutional principles at stake, the Stamp Act represented something far more dangerous than a tax. It represented a fundamental assault on the principle of self-governance. The colonists had, for generations, taxed themselves through their own elected colonial assemblies. The Stamp Act was different. It was a tax imposed directly by Parliament, a body in which the American colonies had no elected representation whatsoever. Out of this grievance emerged the rallying cry that would echo through the coming decade: no taxation without representation. It was not, at its heart, a rejection of British authority altogether, but an assertion of what many colonists, including Adams, believed were their rights as Englishmen under the British Constitution itself, rights they felt Parliament was now trampling. John Adams threw himself into the resistance with the same intensity he brought to everything. He anonymously authored a series of essays, later collected and published as a dissertation on the canon and feudal law, in which he argued that the liberties of the colonists were not gifts bestowed by the crown, but were instead inherent rights, rooted in natural law and in the historical struggle of the English people against tyranny, both religious and political. He drafted instructions for the town of Braintree protesting the Stamp Act, instructions that were subsequently adopted, with modifications, by other towns across Massachusetts, giving the young lawyer his first taste of genuine political influence beyond the courtroom. He also took on legal work opposing the Stamp Act's implementation, arguing before the royal governor that the courts of Massachusetts should remain open and functioning despite the absence of the required stamps, a bold legal maneuver that further raised his profile. The Stamp Act crisis revealed something important about John Adams that would define his entire public career. He was, by temperament and conviction, a constitutionalist. He did not arrive at his politics through mob enthusiasm or simple resentment of authority. He arrived through painstaking legal and historical reasoning, through a genuine belief that there existed a correct constitutional order, and that Parliament's actions were a violation of that order, which could be demonstrated through careful argument. This intellectual rigor would make him, in time, one of the most formidable political minds of the revolutionary generation, even as it sometimes made him impatient with those who acted from passion rather than principle. The Stamp Act was eventually repealed in 1766, a victory that brought celebration throughout the colonies, but the underlying constitutional dispute had not been resolved, merely postponed. Parliament, even as it repealed the act, passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. It was a warning that the conflict was far from over, and within a year, new revenue measures, the Townshend Acts, would reignite colonial resistance and deepen the rift between Britain and her American subjects. Throughout these years, Adams continued building his legal practice, eventually relocating his family to Boston itself, the bustling, contentious heart of colonial Massachusetts. A city of perhaps 15,000 souls crowded onto a narrow peninsula, its wharves alive with shipping, its taverns and town meetings alive with political argument. Boston in the late 1760s was becoming the epicenter of colonial resistance to British policy, home to firebrands like Samuel Adams, John's older cousin, a man whose talent for organizing popular sentiment and orchestrating political resistance complemented John's more cerebral, legalistic temperament. Where Samuel Adams could rouse a crowd, John Adams could construct an argument that would withstand the scrutiny of the most learned minds in the British Empire. Together, though often through different methods, the two cousins would become central figures in the movement that was, almost imperceptibly at first, transforming from a defense of English liberties into something genuinely revolutionary. It was in this charged atmosphere, on a cold night in March of 1770, that an event occurred which would test John Adams's principles in the most dramatic and dangerous fashion of his career to that point. British soldiers stationed in Boston, deeply resented by much of the populace for their role in enforcing unpopular parliamentary measures, found themselves confronted by an angry crowd near the Custom House on King Street. Tensions had been building for months between the soldiers and Boston's working class, who saw the troops as instruments of oppression competing for jobs and provoking constant friction. On this particular night, a mob gathered, taunting and pelting a small detachment of soldiers with snowballs, ice, and stones. In the chaos and confusion, shots rang out. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying in the snow. The event would come to be known as the Boston Massacre, and it sent a shock wave of outrage through the city and, soon, through the colonies at large. Patriot leaders like Samuel Adams seized upon the killings as powerful propaganda, evidence of British tyranny made horrifyingly literal. Paul Revere's engraving of the scene, depicting a disciplined line of redcoats firing in cold blood upon a peaceful crowd, circulated widely and inflamed public sentiment further. The captain of the British detachment, Thomas Preston, and 8 of his soldiers were arrested and charged with murder. And then came the moment that would test John Adams's character more severely than anything in his career to that point. The soldiers needed legal defense, and in the superheated atmosphere of Boston in the spring of 1770, virtually no attorney in the city wanted to touch the case. To defend British soldiers who had killed American colonists was to risk one's reputation, one's livelihood, perhaps even one's physical safety, in a city where public sentiment ran overwhelmingly toward the soldiers' guilt. Yet Adams, after careful deliberation, agreed to take the case. His reasoning, which he would articulate and defend for the rest of his life, was rooted in his unwavering belief that the foundation of a just society was the rule of law, applied impartially, even, especially, to the most unpopular of defendants. He believed that no man, however despised, however inflamed the public passion against him, should be denied a fair trial and a vigorous defense. To do otherwise, Adams believed, was to replace the rule of law with the rule of the mob, and a society governed by mob justice was no freer than one governed by royal tyranny. It was, in Adams's mind, a matter of fundamental principle that the very liberties the colonists were fighting to preserve required that even British soldiers receive a fair hearing under colonial law. The decision was not made lightly, and it came at real personal cost. Adams's legal practice suffered. He and his family faced social ostracism from some quarters and, by his own account, genuine fear of mob violence. But he proceeded with the defense, working alongside the young attorney Josiah Quincy, and he approached the case with the same rigorous, methodical preparation he brought to every legal challenge. The trials, conducted separately for Captain Preston and for the enlisted soldiers, became a showcase for Adams's formidable legal mind. He did not attempt to claim the soldiers had done nothing wrong. Instead, he constructed a defense built on the precise legal distinctions between murder and manslaughter, arguing that the soldiers, surrounded by a threatening mob, pelted with projectiles, and in genuine fear for their lives, had acted in a manner that, while resulting in tragic deaths, did not rise to the level of premeditated murder under the law. In his closing argument, Adams uttered words that would echo through American legal history, declaring that facts are stubborn things, and that whatever our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. It was a defense of reasoned justice over inflamed sentiment, delivered by a man who himself sympathized deeply with the patriot cause, but who refused to let that sympathy corrupt his commitment to fair process. The results vindicated his careful strategy. Captain Preston was acquitted entirely, the jury unable to find sufficient evidence that he had ordered his men to fire. Of the 8 soldiers tried, 6 were acquitted outright, and 2 were convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter, receiving reduced punishment under the legal device known as benefit of clergy, which spared them the gallows in favor of being branded on the thumb. It was, by any measure, a remarkable legal achievement, and it cemented Adams's reputation as one of the most skilled attorneys in Massachusetts. But the case exacted a toll. Adams would later write that the suffering it caused him, in lost income, lost popularity, and the anxiety of the proceedings, was the most exhausting and trying period of his career. Yet he would also come to regard his defense of the British soldiers as one of the best pieces of service he ever rendered to his country, a demonstration to history that the American cause for liberty was rooted not in lawless passion, but in genuine devotion to justice and constitutional principle, even when applied to one's adversaries. It revealed the essential paradox of John Adams's character, a man capable of fierce political passion who nonetheless held an even fiercer commitment to the rule of law, a tension that would define much of his public life in the turbulent years to come. In the aftermath of the Boston Massacre trial, John Adams found himself drawn ever more deeply into the political life of Massachusetts, even as he continued to harbor genuine ambivalence about abandoning the law for the uncertain and often thankless world of public office. He was elected to represent Boston in the Massachusetts House of Representatives in 1770, a position that placed him squarely within the colony's ongoing constitutional struggle against royal authority. He served as well in other capacities, including a brief and uncomfortable stint as a royally appointed advisor that he ultimately resigned, finding himself unable to reconcile loyalty to the Crown's officers with his deepening convictions about colonial rights. Throughout these years, his diary reveals a man torn between the pull of ambition for distinguished public service and a genuine love of the quiet domestic life he shared with Abigail and their growing family, a tension he would never fully resolve and would feel acutely for the rest of his life, especially during the long absences from home that lay ahead. The early 1770s brought a deceptive lull in the open conflict between Britain and her colonies, but it was a lull that masked deepening currents of distrust on both sides of the Atlantic. Then, in December of 1773, came the event that would shatter any remaining illusion of reconciliation on the cheap. Parliament's Tea Act, intended to bail out the financially struggling East India Company by granting it a virtual monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, was seen by many colonists not as a minor commercial regulation, but as a renewed assertion of Parliament's right to tax America, without consent, dressed up in the guise of a business arrangement. In Boston, a group of patriots, thinly disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships in the harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water, an act of defiance that came to be known as the Boston Tea Party. John Adams was not among the men who carried out the destruction of the tea, but he watched the event and its aftermath with the keen, analytical eye of a man who understood he was witnessing a turning point. In his diary, he recorded his astonishment at the boldness, the magnificence, the dignity of the act, even as he recognized its enormous and unpredictable consequences. He understood, with a clarity many of his contemporaries lacked, that this was not a matter that could be easily smoothed over. Britain's response confirmed his instincts. Parliament, outraged at the destruction of valuable property and determined to reassert its authority, passed a series of punitive measures in 1770 for that the colonists would call the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed to commerce until the destroyed tea was paid for. The Massachusetts colonial charter was effectively suspended in favor of direct royal control, and town meetings, the very institution in which Adams's own father had participated and through which colonial self-governance had long functioned, were sharply restricted. These measures, intended by Parliament to isolate and punish Massachusetts as an example to the other colonies, had precisely the opposite effect. Rather than intimidating the other colonies into compliance, the Intolerable Acts convinced colonists from Virginia to New Hampshire that what had happened to Massachusetts could happen to any of them, that the rights and self-governing institutions they had built over generations were now under direct and serious threat from a parliament that recognized no limits on its authority. Out of this shared alarm came the call for a Continental Congress, a gathering of delegates from across the 13 colonies to coordinate a unified response to British policy. John Adams was elected as one of 5 delegates to represent Massachusetts at this First Continental Congress, set to convene in Philadelphia in September of 1774. For Adams, the journey itself was a revelation. He had, until this point, lived almost his entire life within the relatively confined world of Massachusetts, and the trip to Philadelphia exposed him for the first time to the vast diversity of the American colonies, to the different customs, religions, economic interests, and political temperaments of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the colonies beyond. He met delegates from Virginia like the eloquent and fiery Patrick Henry, the quietly formidable George Washington, and the patrician Richard Henry Lee. He encountered the radical pamphleteer instincts of South Carolina's delegation alongside the more cautious, commercially minded representatives of Pennsylvania and New York, men who still harbored genuine hope for reconciliation with Britain and feared that bold action might tip the colonies into a war they were ill-prepared to fight. This First Continental Congress did not yet contemplate independence. Its purpose was to formulate a unified colonial response to the intolerable acts, and after weeks of debate, it produced a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, asserting the colonies' rights to legislate for themselves in matters of internal policy, while still, notably, professing loyalty to the king and seeking reconciliation with Britain on fair terms. The Congress also organized the Continental Association, a coordinated boycott of British goods intended to pressure Parliament economically into repealing its punitive measures. Adams contributed actively to these deliberations, his legal training proving invaluable in the careful drafting of grievances and resolutions. But he left Philadelphia with a growing private conviction, one he did not yet voice openly, that reconciliation with Britain on terms that would preserve genuine colonial self-government was becoming less and less likely. The gulf between what the colonies believed they were entitled to and what Parliament was willing to concede seemed, to Adams's clear-eyed assessment, simply too wide to bridge through petition and protest alone. He returned home to Massachusetts in the winter of 1774 to find the colony in a state of mounting tension that bordered on de facto war. Royal authority was collapsing outside of British-occupied Boston itself. Massachusetts colonists were organizing their own extra-legal provincial congress, training militia companies, and stockpiling arms and gunpowder in defiance of royal proclamations. It was in this atmosphere, in the early months of 1775, that Adams, writing under pseudonyms as he so often did in these years, engaged in a vigorous newspaper debate defending the constitutional rights of the colonies against loyalist critics, sharpening publicly the arguments he had been developing privately for a decade about the limits of parliamentary authority over the American colonies. Then, in April of 1775, the war that Adams had quietly feared and perhaps even anticipated finally arrived in earnest. British regulars, marching from Boston toward Concord to seize colonial military supplies, exchanged fire with colonial militia at Lexington and Concord, and what had been a war of words and economic pressure became, in a single bloody day, a shooting war. The countryside around Boston erupted into armed conflict, with colonial militia besieging the British-occupied city in the weeks that followed. It was against this dramatically transformed backdrop that the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May of 1775, and John Adams returned to that city as a man whose private convictions about the necessity of independence were rapidly hardening into public conviction, even as many of his fellow delegates still clung to hopes of reconciliation. Adams found himself increasingly impatient with what he saw as the excessive caution of more conservative delegates, men like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, who continued to push for conciliatory measures even as armed colonists and British soldiers were actively killing one another in Massachusetts. Adams's private correspondence from this period reveals his mounting frustration, his sense that events on the ground had already outpaced the willingness of Congress to act decisively. Yet for all his impatience, Adams proved himself during these months to be an extraordinarily effective political operator, a man whose combination of intellectual force, tireless work ethic, and genuine strategic shrewdness made him one of the most consequential members of the Congress, even though he never held its presidency or sought its most visible offices. It was Adams who recognized that for the rebellion to succeed, it needed to become a truly continental effort rather than a Massachusetts quarrel, and it was Adams who therefore made one of the most politically astute proposals of the entire Revolutionary period. He nominated George Washington of Virginia, rather than a New England general, to command the colonial forces besieging Boston. The choice was deliberate and strategic. By placing a Virginian at the head of what was, at that point, almost entirely a New England army, Adams helped bind the Southern colonies more tightly to a cause that might otherwise have been dismissed as a parochial New England rebellion. It was a decision that demonstrated Adams's growing skill not merely as a constitutional theorist, but as a practical statesman capable of thinking beyond the interests of his own region toward the larger cause of continental unity. Through the remainder of 1775 and into the early months of 1776, Adams labored within Congress with extraordinary energy, serving on numerous committees, drafting correspondence and resolutions, and gradually, patiently, working to shift the Assembly's collective will toward the conclusion he had privately reached. That independence was no longer merely one possible outcome among several, but the only path consistent with the colony's safety, dignity, and the principles for which blood was already being shed at Lexington, Concord, and by the summer of 1775, at Bunker Hill as well. It was a campaign of persuasion that would occupy him through the late winter and spring of 1776, as the movement for independence built, slowly and against considerable resistance, toward its climactic moment. The winter of 1775 into 1776 was, for John Adams, a season of relentless, grinding political labor, the kind of work that rarely makes for dramatic storytelling, but without which no revolution could have succeeded. He sat on committee after committee in the Continental Congress, helping to organize a navy where none had existed, working to secure foreign supplies of arms and gunpowder for the colonial forces now besieging Boston, and corresponding extensively with political allies both inside and outside Congress to build support for the cause he had come to believe was inevitable and necessary. He was, by his own admission and by the testimony of his colleagues, often abrasive in these efforts. He could be impatient with delay, sharp-tongued toward those he considered overly cautious, and entirely unwilling to disguise his contempt for what he saw as half-hearted half-measures. Yet this same intensity made him one of the indispensable engines driving Congress toward decisive action. The intellectual and rhetorical landscape shifted decisively in January of 1776 with the publication of Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense. Paine, writing in plain, forceful prose accessible to ordinary colonists rather than only the educated elite, made the case for independence with a directness that earlier, more cautious arguments had avoided. He attacked the very institution of hereditary monarchy itself, arguing that the idea of one man inheriting the right to rule over millions was, on its face, absurd and contrary to reason. The pamphlet sold in extraordinary numbers throughout the colonies and dramatically accelerated public sentiment toward independence. Adams admired the pamphlet's persuasive power and its timing, recognizing immediately its enormous political utility, even as he privately harbored reservations about some of Paine's more radical constitutional notions, particularly Paine's rather simplistic vision for how a new American government might be structured. True to his nature, Adams responded by drafting his own pamphlet, Thoughts on Government, offering a far more carefully reasoned blueprint for Republican government, complete with arguments for a separation of powers between executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and for a bicameral legislature designed to balance popular passion against the need for deliberative wisdom. It was an early and important articulation of constitutional principles that would echo, years later, in the actual government of the United States and in the Constitution Adams himself would help write for Massachusetts. Through the early months of 1776, momentum built steadily toward the question that could no longer be avoided. Colony after colony began instructing their delegates in Congress to support independence, as royal governors fled their posts and provincial governments increasingly operated as independent political entities in all but name. On the 7th of June, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, acting on instructions from his colony's convention, rose in Congress and introduced a resolution declaring that the United Colonies were, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain was, and ought to be, totally dissolved. The resolution ignited fierce debate. Delegates from colonies not yet authorized by their home governments to support such a measure, including Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and South Carolina, urged delay, fearing premature action might fracture the fragile colonial unity Congress had worked so hard to build. John Adams rose as one of the resolution's most forceful advocates, arguing with characteristic vigor and precision that the time for half measures had long since passed, that the actions of the colonies had already, in substance, constituted independence, and that Congress now needed only to formally declare what circumstances had already made true. After extensive debate, Congress reached a compromise. A vote on Lee's resolution would be postponed for 3 weeks to give the hesitant colonies time to receive new instructions. But in the meantime, a committee would be appointed to draft a formal declaration explaining and justifying independence to the world, so that no time would be lost should the resolution ultimately pass. This committee of 5, as it came to be known, included John Adams, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert R. Livingston of New York. It fell to this small group to determine who among them would actually draft the document. And it is here that one of the most consequential moments in American history occurred almost as an act of collegial deference. By Adams's own later recollection, the committee initially looked to him, given his prominence in the independence debate, to write the draft. Adams, however, declined, urging instead that the task fall to Jefferson. His reasoning, as he later recounted it, was characteristically self-aware and shrewdly political in equal measure. He believed Jefferson possessed a particular gift for elegant, persuasive composition that exceeded his own more combative, legalistic style. He also recognized, with considerable political wisdom, that as a New England delegate already deeply unpopular with conservative factions for his aggressive advocacy of independence, he himself was, in his words, obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular, while Jefferson, a Virginian, carried none of that baggage and could draft a document more likely to be embraced without the taint of factional resentment. It was a remarkable act of political self-effacement from a man not typically inclined towards self-effacement, and it gave history one of its most consequential documents, penned by Jefferson's hand but shaped, in its final form, by the input and revision of the entire committee, Adams included. While Jefferson labored over the draft in his rented rooms, Adams continued his parallel and equally vital work within Congress itself, lobbying delegates, answering objections, and building the votes necessary to secure passage of Lee's resolution when the postponed vote finally arrived. On the 1st of July, 1776, Congress convened to debate the question of independence in earnest, with John Dickinson delivering an impassioned final speech against the resolution, warning of the dangers and uncertainties of declaring independence without secured foreign alliances or a unified, prepared military force. It fell to John Adams to rise and deliver the Congress's principal response in favor of independence, and though no verbatim transcript of his remarks survives, those who heard him speak that day, including Jefferson himself, later described Adams's address as a masterpiece of forceful, persuasive oratory, delivered with what Jefferson called a power of thought and expression that moved his listeners from their seats. Jefferson would later refer to Adams as the colossus of that debate, the single most important voice arguing the case for independence on the floor of Congress. That on the 2nd of July, 1776, the vote was finally taken, and 12 of the 13 colonies voted in favor of Lee's resolution declaring independence, with New York's delegation abstaining only because they had not yet received updated instructions from home, though they too would shortly affirm their support. It was this vote, on July 2nd, that John Adams believed history would forever celebrate as America's true Day of Independence. In an exuberant letter to Abigail written the following day, he predicted that the 2nd of July would be commemorated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival, marked with pomp and parade, with games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of the continent to the other. He was, in substance, entirely correct about how Americans would come to celebrate their independence, mistaken only in the specific date, for it would be the 4th of July, the day on which Congress formally adopted the text of the Declaration itself after 2 days of further debate and editing, that would become fixed in the American memory and calendar. The drafting committee's document, after Jefferson's initial composition, had passed through revision by Adams and Franklin before being submitted to the full Congress, which then spent considerable time further editing the text, trimming and altering passages, most notably removing Jefferson's lengthy condemnation of the institution of slavery and the slave trade. A passage struck at the insistence of delegates from southern colonies and some northern merchants involved in the slave trade, a fateful compromise whose consequences would echo through the unresolved tensions of the new nation for generations to come. Adams, watching this editing process unfold, found himself frustrated by what he considered unnecessary alterations to Jefferson's prose, though he recognized the political necessity of securing unanimous or near-unanimous support for the final document. On the 4th of July, 1776, Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence, a document that, in its ringing assertion that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, articulated a philosophical justification for revolution that would resonate far beyond the immediate circumstances of the American colonies, shaping the political imagination of the world for centuries afterward. For John Adams personally, the achievement of independence was the fulfillment of years of patient, often unpopular advocacy, the vindication of convictions he had held and argued since the earliest days of the Stamp Act crisis more than a decade before. Yet he understood, with characteristic clear-sightedness, that the Declaration of Independence was merely the beginning of an immensely more difficult task, the actual winning of that independence on the battlefield, against the most powerful military and naval power in the world, and the equally daunting task of building durable institutions of government to give substance to the principles the Declaration had proclaimed. The war that had already begun at Lexington and Concord would now continue with the full moral and political weight of a nation that had formally declared itself free, even as it remained, for years to come, a fragile and uncertain experiment whose survival was anything but assured. The summer of 1776 brought little respite from the burdens of revolution, even as Congress celebrated the monumental achievement of independence. John Adams, ever restless and ever conscious of unfinished work, immediately turned his formidable energies toward the practical machinery required to sustain the new nation's war effort and its claim to legitimate statehood. He served on what felt to him like an endless succession of committees, work he sometimes described in his letters to Abigail with a mixture of pride and genuine exhaustion. He chaired the Board of War and Ordnance, a position that placed him, a man with no military training whatsoever, in the extraordinary position of overseeing much of the Continental Army's logistics, supply, and personnel matters, corresponding directly with General Washington on questions of strategy, troop levels, and the agonizing scarcities of arms, gunpowder, clothing, and pay that plagued the Continental forces throughout the war's early years. It was grueling, unglamorous labor, the kind of administrative toil that rarely appears in popular memory of the Revolution, but without which Washington's army could not have survived its earliest and most precarious campaigns. The military situation in the months following independence offered little immediate cause for celebration. Washington's forces suffered a series of demoralizing defeats around New York in the late summer and autumn of 1776, nearly losing the entire Continental Army to British General William Howe's superior numbers and naval power. The cause that had been declared with such soaring rhetoric in Philadelphia seemed, by the bleak winter of 1776, to be teetering on the edge of catastrophic collapse. Saved only by Washington's daring Christmas night crossing of the Delaware River and the small, but psychologically vital victories at Trenton and Princeton that followed. Adams, monitoring these developments from Philadelphia and from his periodic returns home to Massachusetts, understood with painful clarity just how fragile the entire enterprise remained, how easily a single catastrophic defeat or the capture of Washington's army might have extinguished the rebellion before it had truly begun. Throughout these anxious years, Adams's letters to Abigail, separated from him for long stretches as he attended to congressional business in Philadelphia while she managed their farm and family in Braintree, reveal the profound personal cost of revolutionary service. Their correspondence, remarkably preserved, stands today as one of the richest windows historians possess into the intimate experience of the Revolutionary era, a record of two extraordinary minds discussing politics, philosophy, family, and the anguish of separation in equal measure. Abigail, managing the household economy amid wartime scarcity and inflation, raising their children largely alone, and at times hearing the very sounds of distant battle from their farm, proved herself throughout these years to be not merely a devoted wife, but a political partner of genuine substance, whose observations on the unfolding revolution and whose now famous urging that the new laws of the nation remember the rights of women reveal a mind every bit as engaged with the great questions of the age as her husband's own. By late 1777, Congress, recognizing the desperate need to secure foreign assistance, particularly from France, Britain's longtime rival, for the struggling American cause, turned to Adams for a mission that would fundamentally reshape the remainder of his revolutionary career and take him away from his family for years at a stretch. Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane had already been dispatched to Paris to negotiate with the French court, seeking the military supplies, financial loans, and ultimately the formal alliance that American strategists believed essential to any realistic hope of defeating Britain. Word reached Congress in late 1777 of a complication involving Deane's conduct and competence that required additional capable hands in Paris, and Adams was selected to join the American Commission in France. The decision to leave required of Adams an almost unbearable personal sacrifice. He would be crossing a winter Atlantic Ocean during wartime, with British naval vessels actively hunting American shipping, a journey of genuine mortal danger. He would be separated from Abigail and their children for an unknown and likely lengthy duration. And he resolved, in a decision that speaks volumes about both his sense of paternal duty and his belief in the formative value of direct exposure to the wider world, to bring along his 10-year-old son, John Quincy Adams, who would thereby begin an extraordinary education in European diplomacy and statecraft that would shape the remarkable career the younger Adams would himself pursue in the decades to come. Father and son departed in February of 1778 aboard the frigate Boston, enduring a harrowing crossing marked by violent storms, a lightning strike that injured several crew members, and a tense naval encounter with a British vessel that the Boston managed to outmaneuver and ultimately to engage and capture, an experience that left the young John Quincy Adams with vivid and lasting memories of the war's dangers. They arrived in France in April of 1778, only to discover, almost immediately upon landing, that they had crossed the ocean for a mission that had, in a sense, already succeeded before they arrived. News reached them that France, persuaded in part by the dramatic American victory over British forces at Saratoga the previous autumn, a victory that demonstrated the rebellion possessed genuine military viability, had formally signed treaties of alliance and commerce with the United States in February of 1778, even as Adams was still crossing the Atlantic. This was a transformative development for the American cause, arguably the single most consequential diplomatic achievement of the entire Revolutionary War. France's entry into the conflict on the American side would eventually bring not only desperately needed financial loans and military supplies, but, crucially, French naval power capable of contesting British control of American waters and eventually French troops who would fight alongside Washington's Continental Army. Adams arrived in Paris to find the American diplomatic mission already engaged in implementing and managing this newly formed alliance. Working alongside Benjamin Franklin, whose extraordinary personal popularity at the French court, his carefully cultivated image as a simple, virtuous philosopher from the American wilderness, had made him perhaps the single most beloved foreign figure in all of Paris. Adams's working relationship with Franklin during this period would prove complicated and, at times, genuinely strained. The two men possessed profoundly different temperaments and approaches to diplomacy. Franklin operated through charm, patience, indirection, and an instinctive understanding of French court culture, comfortable navigating the social rituals and leisurely pace of Versailles diplomacy, willing to let matters develop gradually through cultivated personal relationships. Adams, by contrast, was direct to the point of bluntness, impatient with what he regarded as inefficiency and excessive deference toward French sensibilities, and deeply suspicious that Franklin's evident enjoyment of Parisian social life sometimes came at the expense of the rigorous, businesslike attention to American interests that Adams believed the desperate circumstances of the war demanded. Adams's diary and letters from this period contain pointed, sometimes harsh private criticisms of Franklin's habits, even as he continued to recognize and respect Franklin's unmatched diplomatic value to the American cause. It was a friction born partly of genuinely different diplomatic philosophies and partly, perhaps, of Adams's own characteristic impatience with anyone whose methods diverged from his own exacting standards. Congress, learning of tensions and inefficiencies within the three-man American Commission in Paris, eventually restructured the mission, and in 1779 Adams found himself, after a brief return home to Massachusetts during which he participated in drafting the Massachusetts State Constitution, a document whose framework of separated governmental powers would later influence the federal Constitution itself, sent back across the Atlantic on a new and specific diplomatic assignment, to serve as the man prepared to negotiate peace terms and a commercial treaty with Great Britain whenever the British government might prove willing to discuss ending the war. This second European mission would occupy Adams for years and would carry him not only to France but eventually to the Netherlands, where he undertook what would become one of his most significant and personally satisfying diplomatic achievements. Arriving in the Dutch Republic in the early 1780s, Adams set himself the formidable task of persuading the cautious, commercially minded Dutch government to formally recognize American independence and to extend the new nation a substantial loan, crucial financial support that the struggling American war effort and the equally struggling continental currency desperately required. The Dutch, wary of provoking British retaliation against their own valuable commercial interests, proved initially resistant to American overtures, and Adams pursued the negotiation with characteristic patience and persistence over many months, working without the instinctive social advantages that had smoothed Franklin's path in Paris, relying instead on methodical argument, persistent lobbying of Dutch officials and bankers, and the slowly shifting tide of European opinion as American battlefield fortunes, bolstered by French assistance, gradually improved. His efforts ultimately succeeded spectacularly. In April of 1782, the Netherlands formally recognized the United States as an independent nation, and Adams subsequently negotiated a loan from Dutch bankers that provided critical financial support to the American war effort, along with a treaty of amity and commerce between the two nations. It was an achievement Adams took particular pride in, accomplished largely through his own independent persistence rather than through the assistance of more naturally gifted diplomatic colleagues, and it stood as concrete evidence that the infant United States was steadily gaining the international recognition and material support necessary to sustain its claim to nationhood in the eyes of the world. While Adams labored in the Netherlands through these critical years, the military situation in America had been undergoing its own dramatic transformation. The war that had nearly collapsed in the desperate winter of 1776 had ground on through years of brutal campaigning, shifting fortune, and immense suffering on both sides. The French alliance Adams had helped sustain through his diplomatic labors began, by 1780 and 1781, to yield its full strategic value, as French naval forces and French troops under the Comte de Rochambeau combined with Washington's Continental Army in a campaign that would prove decisive. In October of 1781, this combined Franco-American force, supported critically by French naval control of the Chesapeake Bay that prevented British evacuation or reinforcement by sea, trapped and forced the surrender of a major British army under Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia. It was not, strictly speaking, the final battle of the war, but it proved to be the decisive one, shattering British political will to continue what had become an enormously costly and increasingly unpopular conflict. News of Cornwallis's surrender, when it reached London, prompted Lord North's government to begin the political collapse that would ultimately bring peace-minded ministers to power, willing at last to seriously negotiate an end to the American war. For John Adams, news of these developments arrived amid his own consuming diplomatic labors in the Netherlands, and they signaled that the moment he had long anticipated and specifically been commissioned to manage, the negotiation of peace with Great Britain, was finally drawing near. In 1782, as British political will to continue the war crumbled, and as preliminary contacts toward peace negotiations began, Adams was summoned to Paris to join Benjamin Franklin and the newly appointed John Jay of New York in what would become one of the most consequential diplomatic undertakings in American history. The negotiation of the treaty that would formally end the Revolutionary War and define the terms of American independence. The peace negotiations that unfolded in Paris through 1782 and into 1783 were extraordinarily delicate, complicated not merely by the negotiations with Britain themselves, but by the tangled web of competing interests among America's own allies. France, bound to Spain by treaty obligations and conscious of its own strategic interests in limiting American power and territorial expansion, was not entirely aligned with American objectives, particularly regarding the western boundaries of the new nation and access to the rich fishing grounds off Newfoundland that New England's economy depended upon. The French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, while a genuine and valuable ally, also harbored interest in seeing the negotiations proceed in a manner and on a timeline that served French diplomatic calculations as much as American ones. And there was genuine concern among the American negotiators that France might be willing to settle for terms less generous to the United States than the Americans believed achievable, particularly given Britain's weakened negotiating position following Yorktown. It was John Jay who first proposed, and John Adams who enthusiastically supported once he arrived in Paris, a bold and somewhat controversial decision, that the American commissioners should negotiate directly and separately with the British, rather than proceeding only in close lockstep with their French allies as their formal instructions from Congress technically required. This was a calculated gamble, a departure from official instructions undertaken because Jay and Adams both harbored genuine suspicion that French interests did not perfectly align with American ones on certain crucial points, and because they recognized that Britain, eager to conclude a separate peace with its former colonies and perhaps to drive something of a wedge between America and France in the process, might be willing to offer the United States more generous terms through direct negotiation than might emerge from a process too closely managed by Vergennes and the French court. Franklin, after initial hesitation given his deep personal investment in maintaining French goodwill, ultimately joined Jay and Adams in this approach. Adams threw himself into these negotiations with the same exacting, detail-oriented intensity that had characterized his entire career. He proved particularly forceful and effective on matters touching New England's economic interests, insisting with characteristic stubbornness on securing American fishing rights off the Grand Banks and the coast of Newfoundland, rights of enormous economic importance to the maritime communities of Massachusetts that Adams knew intimately from his own upbringing along that very coast. He fought hard as well on the question of the new nation's western boundaries, working to secure American claims extending to the Mississippi River rather than accepting the more constrained boundaries that some in the negotiation, including elements of the French and Spanish courts, would have preferred to see imposed on the fledgling republic, hemming it more tightly against the Atlantic seaboard. The American negotiators also pressed, with less complete success, on questions regarding the treatment of loyalists whose property had been confiscated during the war and the resolution of pre-war debts owed by Americans to British creditors, issues that would continue to generate friction between the two nations for years after the formal peace. The negotiations concluded with the signing of preliminary articles of peace in November of 1782, followed by the formal Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783, a document that secured for the United States not merely an end to hostilities, but remarkably generous terms overall, including that crucial recognition of American territory extending to the Mississippi River, the valuable fishing rights off Newfoundland that Adams had fought so determinedly to secure, and, most fundamentally, Britain's unambiguous acknowledgement of the United States of America as a free, sovereign, and independent nation. For John Adams, a man who had spent nearly 2 decades of his life, from the earliest stirrings of resistance to the Stamp Act through the long, lonely years of European diplomacy, in pursuit of precisely this outcome, the signing of the Treaty of Paris represented the culmination of his life's central political project. The cause he had argued for in Massachusetts town meetings, defended through his pseudonymous newspaper essays, championed on the floor of the Continental Congress, and ultimately served through years of difficult, often thankless diplomatic labor in the courts of France and the Netherlands, had at last achieved its complete, and internationally recognized fulfillment. In the months following the treaty's signing, as the Long War finally drew to its formal close, and as the other great powers of Europe began, one by one, to extend diplomatic recognition to the United States as a legitimate member of the community of nations, John Adams could look back upon nearly 20 years of continuous public service to a cause that had once seemed, to many reasonable observers on both sides of the Atlantic, a near impossibility: the successful rebellion of 13 scattered colonies against the most powerful empire on earth, and the establishment, against extraordinarily long odds, of a new independent republic founded upon principles of self-governance and natural rights that Adams himself had helped articulate in the earliest days of constitutional argument against the Stamp Act. He had been, by any honest accounting of the Revolution's history, one of its truly indispensable architects, the relentless constitutional theorist of the early resistance, the defense attorney who insisted that even Britain's soldiers deserved justice, the tireless committee man who helped organize a navy and sustain Washington's army through its darkest hours, the forceful advocate whose oratory helped carry Congress to the vote for independence, the diplomat who secured Dutch recognition and Dutch gold when the American cause needed it most, and finally, one of the three commissioners whose skillful, sometimes audacious negotiation secured a peace more favorable to the new nation than many had thought possible. As 1783 drew toward its close, with peace formally secured and the United States standing, however precariously, as a recognized and independent nation among the powers of the earth, John Adams remained still in Europe, his diplomatic services not yet concluded, new questions of commerce and international relations still awaiting his attention in the years immediately ahead. The war was won. Independence was achieved and acknowledged. The principles proclaimed in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776 had been vindicated not merely by argument, but by force of arms and by the patient, exhausting labor of diplomacy across two continents. But the greater and in some ways more difficult work, the work of building a government and a nation capable of living up to those founding principles, still lay almost entirely ahead, an undertaking in which John Adams, his name now etched permanently among the founders of American independence, would soon find himself called to play a central and demanding role of an entirely different kind. The treaty was signed, the ink dried, the war was over, but John Adams did not go home. While much of America turned toward the work of healing and rebuilding, Adams remained in Europe, still bound to the unglamorous, unfinished business of turning a battlefield victory into a durable peace. The Treaty of Paris had secured independence on paper. It had not secured the 1,000 practical arrangements a new nation needed to survive among the established powers of the world: treaties of commerce, lines of credit, the basic diplomatic infrastructure without which the United States was little more than a promising idea floating unmoored in the Atlantic. In the months following the treaty, Adams continued his labors in the Netherlands and traveled between European capitals, working alongside Franklin and Jefferson, who had now joined the American diplomatic effort in Paris, to negotiate commercial treaties with various European states. It was during this period that Adams's working relationship with Thomas Jefferson, a man with whom his name would be linked, for better and for worse, for the rest of both their lives, truly deepened into something like genuine friendship. The two men, so different in temperament and background, the blunt, voluble Yankee lawyer and the reserved, elegant Virginia planter, found in each other an intellectual companionship that neither quite anticipated. They dined together, attended the theater together, discussed philosophy, science, and politics at length, and Jefferson, still grieving the recent death of his wife, found in the Adams household, and particularly in Abigail, who had at last crossed the Atlantic in 1784 to join her husband after years of painful separation, a warmth and domestic comfort he treasured. Abigail's arrival in Europe, first in Paris and then in London, marked one of the happiest interludes of the Adamses' long marriage, a rare extended period in which the family was finally reunited after years of letters substituting for presents, and her sharp, observant letters home about European court life, fashion, and politics added yet another rich vein to the remarkable correspondence the couple had sustained since their courtship. In 1785, Congress made a decision that would place Adams in one of the most psychologically demanding positions of his entire career. It appointed him the first American minister to the Court of St. James's, the official representative of the United States to the very government against which he had spent 2 decades of his life in determined opposition. It was, on its face, an almost unbearable irony, and Adams himself recognized the strangeness of the assignment. He was to present himself before King George III, the monarch under whose authority British soldiers had occupied Boston, whose ministers had closed its port and dissolved its charter, whose troops had fired upon Americans at Lexington and Concord, and whose armies Adams had spent years working to defeat through diplomacy, legislation, and the organization of an army. Now he would stand before that same king as the official envoy of the nation that had wrested its independence from him. The audience took place in June of 1785, and accounts of the meeting, recorded by Adams himself, reveal a moment of genuine historical poignancy beneath its formal diplomatic surface. Adams, by his own description, addressed the king with careful, measured words, expressing his hope of restoring the fullest measure of confidence, esteem, and affection, or, as Adams characteristically and somewhat undiplomatically phrased it, the good old nature and the good old humor between peoples of the same language, blood, and religion. King George, who had reportedly told an earlier American visitor that he had been the last man in his kingdom to consent to American independence, but would also be the last to violate it now that it existed, responded to Adams with what Adams described as visible emotion, telling the new minister that he had done his duty in opposing the king's former policies just as the king had done his duty in pursuing them, and that he, the king, was glad the choice had fallen upon Adams to represent the new nation. It was a moment of remarkable grace on both sides. Two men who had been, in the most literal sense, adversaries in a war, meeting now as representatives of nations attempting to forge a new and peaceful relationship out of the wreckage of the old one. Yet the substance of Adams's mission in London proved, over the following years, deeply frustrating and largely unsuccessful, a source of mounting personal disillusionment that would shape his political thinking for the rest of his life. The British government, having lost the war but having lost little of its commercial leverage over the struggling new nation, showed scant interest in negotiating the kind of reciprocal commercial treaty Adams had been sent to secure. British ports remained largely closed to American shipping under the Navigation Acts, even as British merchants continued to enjoy access to American markets. British troops, in violation of the Treaty of Paris's terms, remained stationed in forts along the American northwestern frontier, ostensibly pending resolution of pre-war debt disputes, but in practice continuing to support and arm Native American resistance to American westward expansion and serving as a persistent irritant and potential flashpoint between the two nations. Adams pressed these grievances repeatedly and forcefully with British ministers, only to be met with polite evasion, bureaucratic delay, and an unmistakable undertone of condescension toward the fledgling republic and its blunt-spoken representative. What made these years in London especially galling for Adams was his growing recognition that much of his diplomatic weakness stemmed not from any failure of his own skill or persistence, but from a structural defect in the very government he represented. The United States, operating under the Articles of Confederation, the loose framework of national government adopted during the war, possessed no effective power to enforce treaties, regulate interstate or international commerce, raise reliable revenue, or compel the individual states to honor national obligations. Adams found himself in the humiliating position of demanding that Britain fulfill its treaty obligations regarding the frontier forts, only to be reminded, not unfairly, that several American states were themselves violating the treaty by obstructing British creditors from collecting pre-war debts and by failing to restore confiscated Loyalist property as the treaty had promised. Britain had little incentive to negotiate seriously with a national government that could not even guarantee its own states would honor its commitments. Adams watched this dynamic unfold with mounting alarm, and the experience crystallized in him a conviction that would soon place him at the center of one of the most consequential political transformations in American history. The conviction that the Articles of Confederation, however well-suited they may have seemed to a nation suspicious of centralized power after years of resisting a distant king, were simply inadequate to the demands of genuine nationhood, and that without a stronger, more energetic federal government, the independence so dearly won might prove, in practical terms, a hollow and fragile achievement. It was during these London years that Adams, drawing on his diplomatic frustrations and his deepening study of governments throughout history, undertook one of his most significant intellectual projects, the writing of his lengthy treatise, A Defense of the Constitutions of Government of the United States of America. Composed across multiple volumes and published between 1787 and 1788, the work was Adams's attempt to systematically examine the constitutions of ancient and modern republics, from classical Greece and Rome through the Italian city-states and the contemporary state constitutions of America itself, in order to demonstrate the wisdom of balanced government, divided among distinct branches and checked by competing interests, as the only reliable safeguard against the twin dangers that haunted Adams's political imagination throughout his life: the tyranny of unchecked power concentrated in a single ruler, and the equally dangerous tyranny of an unchecked popular majority, what Adams and many of his contemporaries feared as mob rule or the despotism of pure democracy. Adams's political philosophy, forged across decades of practical experience and historical study, rested on a fundamentally skeptical view of human nature, a conviction rooted partly in his Puritan inheritance and partly in his observation of political life on both sides of the Atlantic, that all men, regardless of their station, harbored within themselves the seeds of ambition, vanity, and the desire to dominate others, and that no class of society, neither hereditary aristocrats nor the common people themselves, could be trusted with unchecked power. Good government, in Adams's view, was not a matter of finding virtuous rulers, for virtue alone could never be relied upon to restrain power indefinitely, but of constructing institutions, a careful architecture of checks and balances, that would compel even ambitious and flawed men to check one another, channeling the inevitable struggle for power into forms that protected liberty rather than destroying it. This body of political thought would prove remarkably, if controversially, influential, just as American statesmen back home were embarking on the very task Adams had been theorizing about from across the Atlantic: the wholesale reconstruction of American national government. News reached Adams in London, through the slow transatlantic exchange of letters and newspapers, that a convention of delegates had assembled in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, ostensibly to revise the Articles of Confederation, but in practice engaged in the far more radical project of drafting an entirely new framework of national government. Adams was not present at this constitutional convention. His diplomatic post kept him in London throughout the deliberations that produced the United States Constitution. Yet his absence from Philadelphia in 1787 did not mean his absence from the intellectual currents that shaped the document. His defense of the constitutions, circulating among American readers even as the convention met, contributed to the broader argument for structured, balanced government that many delegates, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton prominent among them, were independently working to embody in the new Constitution's elaborate system of separated powers, checks and balances, and federalism. Adams would later take a measure of pride, not without some justified resentment at being overlooked, in noting how closely the eventual Constitution structure, its division of government into executive, legislative, and judicial branches, its bicameral legislature, its complex mechanisms for balancing the interests of large and small states, mirrored arguments he had been making in print and in private correspondence for years. The new Constitution, once drafted, faced its own arduous battle for ratification across the 13 states, a contest between Federalists who favored the stronger national government the document proposed and Anti-Federalists who feared it concentrated dangerous power in distant federal hands and threatened to recreate, in Republican guise, the very kind of overweening central authority Americans had fought a revolution to escape. Adams watched this debate unfold from London with great interest, broadly supportive of the stronger union the Constitution promised, though he harbored some private reservations, particularly regarding what he considered the dangerously weak position of the executive branch as initially conceived and discussed, a concern reflecting his lifelong conviction that an energetic, sufficiently empowered executive was essential to prevent the legislature from degenerating into factional chaos. By the summer of 1788, enough states had ratified the Constitution to bring the new government into effect, and attention across America turned to the question of who would fill its highest offices. There was, in truth, remarkably little debate or uncertainty regarding who should become the nation's first president. George Washington, the commanding general whose steady leadership had carried the Continental Army through its darkest years and whose voluntary surrender of military power at the war's conclusion had cemented his reputation as a man of singular, almost mythic civic virtue, was the universal choice. A figure whose selection transcended the emerging factional divisions already visible beneath the surface of American politics. The vice presidency was a different matter, a position whose constitutional design, awarding it to whichever candidate received the second highest number of electoral votes, made it inherently a contest among the various leading statesmen of the new nation. John Adams, his reputation as one of the Revolution's foremost architects and intellectual leaders well established through nearly 2 decades of conspicuous public service, emerged as the leading candidate for the position, and in the elections of early 1789, he received the second highest total of electoral votes, securing his place as the first vice president of the United States under the new Constitution, just as Washington was elected the nation's first president. Adams returned to America in the spring of 1788, having concluded his London mission, reuniting at last with the soil of his homeland after years abroad, and the following year he assumed the vice presidency as the new federal government convened in New York City, the nation's temporary capital. It would prove, almost from its earliest days, to be a position that brought Adams genuine and lasting frustration, a frustration rooted in the peculiar, almost contradictory nature of the office itself. The Constitution assigned the vice president only 2 formal duties: to preside over the Senate, with the power to cast a tie-breaking vote when the chamber was evenly divided, and to wait, in a kind of institutionalized political limbo, for the contingency of the president's death or incapacity. It was a role with almost no independent executive authority, no meaningful policy-making function, scarcely any of the substantive influence that a man of Adams's experience, intellect, and towering self-regard might reasonably have expected after decades of consequential service to the revolutionary cause. Adams, characteristically, found himself unable to simply endure this constraint in dignified silence. In the Senate's early sessions, he involved himself energetically, perhaps excessively, in procedural and substantive debates, including a protracted and ultimately somewhat embarrassing controversy over what formal titles should be used to address the president, with Adams favoring grand, almost monarchical honorifics like His Highness or His Elective Majesty. Arguments he made in good faith out of genuine concern that the new republic projects sufficient dignity and stability in the eyes of a watching world, particularly the still skeptical courts of Europe. The controversy, however, struck many Americans, already wary of any drift toward aristocratic pretension in their new government, as faintly ridiculous and politically tone-deaf, and it earned Adams a derisive nickname that would follow him for years afterward: his rotundity, a mocking reference both to the title controversy and to Adams's increasingly portly physical stature in his middle age. It was an early, telling episode in what would become a recurring pattern throughout Adams's career. A man of genuine intellectual seriousness and sincere constitutional concern, possessed of real political courage, repeatedly undone in matters of public perception by a certain tone-deafness, a stubborn insistence on his own carefully reasoned position even when it cut sharply against the prevailing currents of public sentiment and political tact. Beyond these early stumbles, Adams settled into a vice presidency that he privately, repeatedly, and with evident bitterness described as the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived, a phrase he confided to Abigail that captures with characteristic Adams' bluntness his genuine frustration at occupying a position of formal prestige but minimal practical power. He cast a significant number of tie-breaking votes in the Senate during his 8 years in office, more than any vice president would cast for well over a century afterward, generally favoring positions that strengthened federal authority and supported the policies of the Washington administration, but the office afforded him little direct influence over the executive branch's actual conduct of government. Decisions that fell instead to Washington and his increasingly important and increasingly divided cabinet, particularly the rival figures of Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton and Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. It was during these years of the Washington administration that the political divisions Adams had long warned against in his theoretical writings, divisions rooted in genuinely different visions of what kind of nation America should become, hardened into the first organized political factions of the new republic, eventually coalescing into the Federalist and Democratic Republican parties that would define American politics for a generation. Hamilton, brilliant, ambitious, and deeply committed to building a powerful, commercially dynamic nation capable of rivaling the great powers of Europe, championed a vigorous program of federal financial consolidation, the assumption of state war debts by the national government, the establishment of a national bank modeled loosely on the Bank of England, and policies generally favoring manufacturing, commerce, and a strong, energetic central government, often interpreting the constitutions, grants of federal power broadly to accomplish these ends. Jefferson, by contrast, increasingly alarmed at what he perceived as dangerous tendencies toward financial speculation, executive overreach, and even monarchical corruption embedded in Hamilton's program, championed a vision of America rooted more firmly in agrarian virtue, states' rights, and a more strictly limited reading of federal constitutional authority. Fearing that Hamilton's policies threatened to recreate, under Republican forms, the very concentrations of moneyed and governmental power that the Revolution had been fought to escape, John Adams found himself, throughout these gathering storms, in a politically ambiguous and personally uncomfortable position. His long-standing theoretical commitment to balanced government, strong executive authority, and skepticism toward unchecked popular passion aligned him, broadly and increasingly, with the emerging Federalist camp and with many of Hamilton's general aims regarding national strength and stability. Yet Adams was never truly a Hamiltonian in temperament or in detailed policy conviction. He harbored deep personal distrust of Hamilton, finding him, despite genuine respect for the younger man's financial acumen, dangerously ambitious, manipulative, and prone to a kind of restless, scheming energy that Adams's own moral sensibilities found distasteful, suspicions that would prove, in time, to be substantially well-founded, and that would eventually erupt into one of the most consequential political rivalries of Adams's later career. At the same time, Adams's old friendship with Jefferson, forged during their shared years of revolutionary service and deepened during their time together in Europe, began to fray under the pressure of these widening ideological divisions, as Jefferson, working with his ally James Madison, became increasingly convinced that Adams's writings, particularly his defense of the constitutions with its frank discussions of balanced government and its occasionally admiring references to certain features of the British constitutional system, revealed dangerous monarchical sympathies that Jefferson believed threatened the republican character of the new nation. It was a painful, slow-motion estrangement between two men who had once shared genuine intellectual and personal affection, and it would deepen considerably in the years immediately ahead, as both men found themselves cast, with Washington's eventual retirement, as the leading rival candidates to succeed him. George Washington's decision, announced in his farewell address of September 1796, to decline a third term as president set in motion the first genuinely contested presidential election in American history, a contest that would crystallize, in the starkest terms yet, the deepening factional divide between Federalists and Democratic Republicans, and that would place John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in direct electoral competition with one another for the first time. Washington's departure was itself an act of profound constitutional significance, establishing by precedent and personal example the principle of voluntary, peaceful relinquishment of executive power that would become one of the defining features of American government, a precedent whose importance neither Adams nor any of his contemporaries underestimated, given how rare such voluntary surrenders of supreme power had proven across the long history of republics and empires that Adams had studied so closely in his political writings. As Washington's natural successor in terms of seniority, experience, and standing within the Federalist coalition, Adams emerged as that party's leading candidate for the presidency, while Jefferson, by now the clear standard-bearer of the opposition Democratic Republicans, represented the alternative vision of American governance that had crystallized in opposition to Hamiltonian financial policy and what Jeffersonians regarded as dangerous Federalist tendencies towards centralized, quasi-aristocratic power. The election of 1796 was conducted under electoral rules quite different from later American practice, with each elector casting 2 votes for president without distinguishing between presidential and vice presidential preferences, the candidate receiving the most electoral votes becoming president and the runner-up becoming vice president, a system that would soon prove deeply, even dangerously flawed, but that in 1796 produced a result of particular irony. Adams narrowly prevailed, receiving 71 electoral votes to Jefferson's 68, making Adams president and, under the rules then in force, making his principal political rival and increasingly estranged former friend his vice president. It was, in retrospect, an almost impossible arrangement, installing 2 men of genuinely opposed political philosophies and increasingly divergent personal loyalties into the executive branch's 2 highest offices simultaneously. A structural flaw in the original constitutional design that the experience of the Adams presidency would help expose, and that would eventually be corrected through constitutional amendment. Adams took the presidential oath of office in March of 1797, succeeding the towering figure of Washington under circumstances that Adams himself recognized as uniquely difficult, inheriting an office whose occupant had, in the person of his predecessor, achieved a kind of near-universal reverence that no successor, however accomplished, could realistically hope to match. Adams later wrote, with characteristic candor about his own anxieties, of feeling the weight of following so beloved and unifying a figure, aware that whatever he accomplished would inevitably be measured against expectations that bordered on the impossible. The presidency Adams inherited was, from its very first months, dominated by a foreign policy crisis of extraordinary gravity and complexity, one that would consume the great majority of his administration's energy and that would test, in the most severe terms imaginable, Adams's commitment to the constitutional principles and the cautious, balanced statesmanship he had spent decades articulating in theory. The crisis centered on revolutionary France, a nation whose own dramatic upheaval, beginning in 1789, had initially been greeted with considerable sympathy by many Americans who saw in it an echo of their own struggle against tyrannical authority, but which had, by the mid-1790s, descended into the bloody chaos of the Terror, the execution of the French king and queen, and a subsequent series of wars against most of the major powers of Europe that left revolutionary France locked in an existential struggle with Britain and its allies. America's relationship with France during this period was complicated immeasurably by the existence of the formal alliance treaty signed in 1778, the very treaty whose negotiation Adams himself had helped secure during the Revolutionary War, an alliance that France now expected the United States to honor by providing material and military support against Britain. The Washington administration, however, had pursued a policy of strict neutrality in the European conflict, formalized through the Jay Treaty of 1795, an agreement with Britain that, while resolving several outstanding disputes from the Revolutionary War period, was perceived by France as a betrayal of the Franco-American alliance and a tilt toward Britain that violated the spirit, if not quite the letter, of America's treaty obligations. France responded with escalating hostility, authorizing its naval vessels and privateers to seize American merchant shipping on a massive scale, a campaign of maritime depredation that, by the time Adams assumed office, had already inflicted devastating losses on American commerce and brought the 2 nations to the brink of open war. Adams, seeking to avert this looming catastrophe through diplomacy rather than armed conflict, dispatched a special commission to Paris in 1797, composed of Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, John Marshall, and Elbridge Gerry, with instructions to negotiate a resolution to the maritime disputes and to restore peaceful relations between the 2 nations. What followed became one of the defining and most damaging episodes of Adams's presidency. The American commissioners, upon arriving in Paris, found themselves approached not by official French negotiators willing to engage in substantive diplomacy, but by intermediaries representing the French Foreign Minister Talleyrand, who demanded, as a precondition for any formal negotiations, a substantial bribe for Talleyrand personally, a formal apology from the United States for past American statements deemed offensive to France, and a sizable loan to the French government. The American envoys, affronted by what amounted to a demand for tribute as the price of mere diplomatic engagement, refused these terms, and the negotiations collapsed entirely, with Pinckney reportedly declaring, in a phrase that would become a celebrated rallying cry once the episode became public, that the answer was no, not a sixpence. When Adams reported the failure of the mission to Congress in early 1798, withholding initially the full details of French demands, Democratic Republicans in Congress, suspicious that Adams was exaggerating French misconduct to justify a more aggressive, pro-British policy, demanded the release of the full diplomatic correspondence. Adams complied, releasing the dispatches with the French agents' names redacted and replaced with the letters X, Y, and Z, and the public reaction to what became known as the XYZ affair was immediate, intense, and overwhelmingly favorable to Adams's administration. The revelation that French officials had demanded bribes as the price of basic diplomatic respect ignited a wave of patriotic outrage across the United States, transforming American public opinion dramatically against France and producing, for a brief and politically significant period, a surge of genuine bipartisan support for Adams and for measures of national defense, with the slogan "Millions for Defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," capturing the moment's popular sentiment. In the wake of the XYZ affair, the United States entered into an undeclared naval conflict with France that historians would come to call the Quasi-War, a period of roughly 2 years, from 1798 to 1800, during which American and French naval vessels engaged in genuine combat on the high seas and in the Caribbean, though without a formal declaration of war from either nation's legislature. Adams, recognizing the United States possessed almost no naval capacity to defend its commerce or its coasts, pushed energetically for the creation of a genuine American Navy, a cause that resulted, during his administration, in the establishment of the Department of the Navy as a distinct executive department and the construction and commissioning of new warships, including frigates that would form the nucleus of a permanent United States naval force and that would prove their worth in engagements against French vessels during the Quasi-War and, in the following decades, against the Barbary corsairs and, famously, against Britain in the War of 1812. The creation of a credible American Navy stands as one of Adams's genuine and lasting institutional achievements, a foundation upon which American naval power would be built for generations, born directly out of the crisis with France that defined the early years of his presidency. Yet even as Adams pursued these measures of national defense and military preparedness, he resisted, with a firmness that would ultimately cost him dearly within his own political party, the mounting pressure from the more militant wing of the Federalists, led informally by the politically resurgent Alexander Hamilton, to seek a full declaration of war against France. Hamilton and his allies, sensing in the crisis an opportunity to build a substantially expanded American army, with Hamilton himself positioned to command it in a role of genuine national prominence and power, pushed hard for escalation, while Adams, drawing on his own deep-seated constitutional caution and his clear-eyed assessment that full-scale war with France offered the United States little strategic advantage and considerable risk, particularly given the still fragile state of American finances and military infrastructure, resisted these pressures with characteristic stubbornness. It was a decision that revealed, in perhaps its clearest form, the genuine independence of Adams's judgment, his willingness to defy even the most powerful factions within his own party when his own careful assessment of the national interest pointed in a different direction, a quality that history would eventually credit as one of his finest acts of statesmanship, even as it cost him dearly in immediate political terms, fracturing the Federalist Party and contributing significantly to the bitter, divisive atmosphere that would characterize the remainder of his single term in office. The crisis with France also produced, in 1798, the most controversial and, to modern eyes, the most troubling domestic policy of Adams's entire presidency, the package of 4 laws collectively known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. passed by the Federalist-controlled Congress amid the genuine fever of war anxiety and anti-French sentiment that gripped the nation in the aftermath of the XYZ affair. These laws extended the period required for immigrants to become naturalized citizens, granted the president sweeping authority to detain or deport non-citizens deemed dangerous to the United States, and, most controversially of all, criminalized the publication of what the law termed false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the federal government, the president, or Congress, with violators subject to fines and imprisonment. The Sedition Act in particular struck directly at the heart of the increasingly vicious partisan newspaper culture of the era, a press environment in which Democratic-Republican editors had grown relentless and often genuinely vicious in their attacks on Adams personally, accusing him in print of monarchical ambitions, of being a hypocrite and a tyrant, of corruption and incompetence, language that by any standard exceeded the bounds of fair political criticism, and that Adams, a man of genuine personal sensitivity beneath his combative public manner, found deeply wounding. Yet the law that resulted from this climate of partisan fury represented an extraordinarily dangerous departure from the principles of free political expression that the American Revolution had been fought, in significant part, to secure, and its application proved this danger in practice. Federal prosecutors, operating under the Sedition Act, brought charges against more than a dozen individuals, the great majority of them Democratic-Republican newspaper editors, and even, in one notorious case, a sitting member of Congress, Matthew Lyon of Vermont, convicted and imprisoned for criticizing the Adams administration in print. The prosecutions, conducted by Federalist judges and federal attorneys who in several instances pursued the law with an aggressive, almost gleeful partisan zeal that went well beyond anything Adams himself had initiated or directly ordered, became, almost immediately, a political catastrophe for the Federalist Party, handing their Democratic-Republican opponents a powerful and entirely legitimate grievance around which to organize, and providing Jefferson and Madison the occasion to draft the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, controversial state declarations asserting the right of individual states to judge the constitutionality of federal law, a doctrine fraught with dangerous implications for the future unity of the Union that would echo, with tragic consequence, in the sectional crises of the following decades. History has rendered a complicated and not entirely flattering judgment on Adams's role in the Alien and Sedition Acts controversy, a judgment that demands honest reckoning rather than either uncritical defense or simple condemnation. Adams did not personally draft the legislation, and surviving evidence suggests he harbored genuine private reservations about aspects of the Sedition Act in particular, viewing it with considerably less enthusiasm than many of the more zealous Federalists in Congress who pushed hardest for its passage. He never personally ordered or directed any of the specific prosecutions brought under the Act, those decisions falling to federal attorneys and judges acting with considerable independent discretion. Yet Adams signed the legislation into law without exercising the veto power the Constitution placed at his disposal, and he made no public effort during his presidency to restrain the most egregious prosecutorial excesses carried out in the law's name. Choices that mark a genuine and significant failure of leadership, however much context and political pressure might help explain, without fully excusing, his conduct. It stands as perhaps the clearest instance in Adams's long public career in which his deep, lifelong anxiety about the dangers of unchecked popular passion and factional disorder led him to tolerate, even if he did not enthusiastically champion, measures that compromised the very constitutional liberties he had spent his life working to establish and defend, a genuine and instructive contradiction at the heart of a presidency otherwise notable for its principled independence. The combined pressures of the Quasi-War, the bitter controversy over the Alien and Sedition Acts, and Adams's increasingly open rupture with the Hamiltonian wing of his own party created, by 1799, a political environment of extraordinary internal Federalist division. Even as Adams pursued what would prove to be one of the genuinely courageous and ultimately vindicated decisions of his presidency. Despite continued pressure from Hamilton and the war hawks within his own party to escalate the conflict with France toward formal war, Adams, upon receiving signals through diplomatic channels that the French government, now under the control of Napoleon Bonaparte following his rise to power, was prepared to negotiate seriously and in good faith, made the decision, against the strenuous objections of much of his own cabinet and his own party's leadership, to dispatch a new peace commission to France in 1799. It was an act of considerable political courage, undertaken by a president who understood clearly that it would further alienate the most powerful and well-organized faction within his own political coalition, but that Adams nonetheless believed was the correct and necessary course for the genuine interests of the nation, a decision that revealed, with unusual clarity, the depth of his independence from factional pressure even at significant personal political cost. This new diplomatic effort succeeded where the earlier mission had so spectacularly failed. Negotiations conducted with Napoleon's government resulted, in 1800, in the Convention of Mortefontaine, formally ending the quasi-war, terminating the troublesome 1778 alliance treaty that had so complicated American foreign policy since the Revolution, and restoring peaceful commercial relations between the United States and France. Adams would, in the years of his retirement that followed, count this peace with France among the achievements of his presidency of which he was proudest, a vindication of his independent judgment over the more bellicose instincts of Hamilton and his allies, and a genuine service to the young nation's interest in avoiding a costly, unnecessary war for which it remained militarily and financially ill-prepared. Yet the political costs of achieving this peace, and of the broader pattern of independent, often unpopular decision-making that characterized Adams's presidency, had by 1800 thoroughly fractured the Federalist Party, with Hamilton and his allies so embittered by Adams's defiance that Hamilton circulated a lengthy, intemperate pamphlet attacking Adams's character and fitness for office, an extraordinary act of intra-party sabotage that did grave damage to Federalist unity at the precise moment the party most needed cohesion to face a resurgent and increasingly well-organized Democratic-Republican opposition. The election of 1800 that followed was, by any measure, one of the most bitter, consequential, and genuinely dangerous political contests in early American history, a rematch between Adams and Jefferson conducted amid a climate of partisan vitriol that frequently descended into the deeply personal, with Federalist newspapers warning that a Jefferson victory would unleash atheism, mob violence, and revolutionary chaos upon America in the manner of the French Terror, while Democratic-Republican papers attacked Adams as a closet monarchist scheming to establish a hereditary American aristocracy. Beneath the overheated rhetoric lay genuine and consequential differences over the proper scope of federal power, the nature of executive authority, and America's posture toward the revolutionary upheavals then transforming Europe, differences that reflected the authentic ideological stakes of the contest even as both sides indulged freely in exaggeration and personal vilification. When the electoral votes were ultimately tallied, Adams had been defeated, receiving 65 electoral votes to a combined 73 for the Democratic-Republican ticket, though a peculiar flaw in the constitutional electoral system, the same flaw that had produced the awkward Adams-Jefferson pairing in 1796, now produced an exact tie between Jefferson and his own running mate, Aaron Burr, throwing the ultimate determination of the presidency into the House of Representatives, where a tense, prolonged series of ballots, conducted amid genuine fears of political crisis or even violence, eventually resolved in Jefferson's favor. For John Adams personally, the defeat of 1800 was a source of genuine and profound disappointment, the first time in his long public career that the American electorate had directly rejected him, a blow to a man whose entire adult life had been organized around public service and the pursuit of historical distinction. He felt the sting of this repudiation deeply, compounded by the painful awareness that the bitter divisions within his own Federalist Party, divisions for which he bore some responsibility, but which had been deliberately and damagingly exacerbated by Hamilton's open hostility, had significantly contributed to his defeat. Adams's final months in office were further darkened by profound personal grief entirely separate from his political fortunes. His son Charles, whose struggles with alcoholism had caused the family considerable private anguish for years, died in the closing weeks of 1800, a loss that compounded the political disappointments of that bitter year with a depth of personal sorrow that those around Adams found genuinely difficult to witness. Yet amid this combination of political defeat and personal grief, John Adams performed, in the final weeks of his presidency, an act of restrained constitutional fidelity whose significance would only grow clearer with the passage of time and the accumulated weight of historical perspective. Despite the bitterness of his defeat, and despite his genuine, well-founded apprehensions about the direction Jefferson's presidency might take the nation, Adams made no attempt to cling to power, raised no challenge to the legitimacy of the election's outcome, and prepared to transfer the authority of his office peacefully to the man who was, by this point in their relationship, not merely his political rival, but someone from whom he felt genuinely and painfully estranged. In the early morning hours of March 4, 1801, the day of Jefferson's inauguration, Adams departed Washington by stagecoach before the formal ceremonies began, a decision that some historians have read as a final act of wounded pride or pointed political protest, declining to attend the inauguration of the man who had defeated him, but which can equally and perhaps more charitably be understood as Adams's characteristically blunt, unceremonious way of completing the essential constitutional act, the peaceful relinquishment of power, without subjecting himself to the additional personal pain of a public ceremony marking his own political repudiation. Whatever his precise motivations, the substantive fact remained, and it was a fact of genuine historical consequence. The United States had conducted its first transfer of presidential power between genuinely opposed political parties, a transition that many skeptical observers in Europe had confidently predicted would end in violence, civil unrest, or the effective collapse of the constitutional experiment altogether, and it had been accomplished peacefully through the orderly mechanisms of law and election, establishing a precedent of democratic succession whose importance to the long-term survival and credibility of American constitutional government can scarcely be overstated. John Adams returned to Massachusetts in the spring of 1801, retreating to the modest but comfortable farmhouse in Quincy, the town into which his native Braintree had been subdivided, that he and Abigail had purchased years before and that they called, with characteristic plainness, Peacefield. He was 65 years old. His public career, after more than 3 decades of nearly continuous service spanning the Stamp Act crisis through the presidency, had come to its definitive end, and he arrived home carrying the genuine weight of electoral defeat, the painful estrangement from a man who had once been among his dearest friends, and a body of public criticism, much of it deeply unfair, that had accumulated around his presidency in the partisan press of the era. What followed was a retirement that would stretch across more than 25 remarkable years, a period in which Adams, freed at last from the relentless demands of public office, turned his still formidable intellectual energies toward farming, reading, an enormous and increasingly candid correspondence, and a sustained, often unflinching process of reflection upon his own life, his role in the founding of the nation, and the uncertain prospects of the republic he had helped to build. The years immediately following his return to Quincy were not without their own quiet satisfactions. Adams threw himself into the management of his farm with genuine enthusiasm, finding in agricultural labor and the rhythms of rural New England life a restorative counterweight to decades of political combat. He read voraciously, ranging across history, philosophy, theology, and the classical literature he had loved since his Harvard days, often filling the margins of his books with extensive, characteristically blunt and opinionated annotations that historians would later mine for insight into the workings of his restless mind. He maintained correspondence with a wide circle of friends, family members, and former colleagues, and Abigail remained, as she had been for nearly 4 decades of marriage, his closest confidant, intellectual partner, and the steadying presence around which the household and his own emotional life continued to revolve. Their partnership, tested by years of separation during the Revolution and by the political storms of his presidency, had only deepened with time into something of remarkable depth and tenderness, evident in the warmth that continued to characterize their correspondence even during the brief periods circumstance still kept them apart, and visible to visitors to Peacefield in the easy, affectionate familiarity between two people who had genuinely grown old together. It was this precious partnership that suffered its final, irrevocable rupture in October of 1818 when Abigail Adams died, almost certainly of typhoid fever, at the age of 73. Her death struck John Adams with a force that even the political disappointments and public humiliations of his earlier life had never approached. In letters to friends and family written in the aftermath of her passing, Adams's grief poured out with a rawness that stripped away decades of public stoicism, describing the desolation of a household and a life from which its essential center had been suddenly and permanently removed. He had, across more than 50 years of marriage, relied upon Abigail not merely for domestic companionship, but as his most trusted political advisor, his sharpest intellectual sparring partner, and the one person whose judgment he consistently valued above his own considerable self-regard. Her loss left him, by his own account and by the testimony of those around him, profoundly and lastingly diminished, an old man now facing the remaining years of his life without the partner who had shared nearly all of them. It was in this same general period of his long retirement, though beginning somewhat earlier and continuing on through these years of personal loss, that one of the most remarkable and historically treasured episodes of Adams's later life unfolded: the gradual, deliberate, and ultimately profound reconciliation between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. For more than a decade following the bitter election of 1800, the two men, who had once shared genuine friendship forged in the crucible of revolution and deepened during their years together in Europe, had remained almost entirely estranged, their relationship poisoned by the accumulated grievances of political rivalry, by Jefferson's role in what Adams perceived as unfair partisan attacks during his presidency, and by the simple, stubborn pride of two aging men, each convinced of the essential rightness of his own historical position. The reconciliation, when it finally came, was facilitated by mutual friends who recognized the tragedy inherent in this estrangement between two men whose contributions to American independence had been so deeply intertwined, most notably through the gentle, persistent encouragement of Benjamin Rush, the Philadelphia physician and fellow signer of the Declaration of Independence, who had remained close to both men and who spent years urging each toward a renewal of their old friendship. On the first day of January, 1812, John Adams, in an act of genuine emotional courage, took the decisive first step, writing a brief, almost tentative letter to Jefferson at Monticello, ostensibly commenting on a small gift of homespun cloth, but in substance extending an unmistakable olive branch after more than a decade of silence. Jefferson, for his part, responded with evident warmth and relief, and from this initial, careful exchange there developed, across the following 14 years, one of the most extraordinary correspondences in American letters, a sustained dialogue between two of the founding era's most penetrating minds that would eventually encompass more than 150 letters, ranging across an immense breadth of subjects. Their shared memories of the Revolution and the Continental Congress, their genuinely differing political philosophies regarding democracy, aristocracy, and the proper structure of republican government, their reflections on religion, classical literature, science, and the nature of the human soul, and, with increasing frequency and poignancy as the years advanced, their candid meditations on old age, mortality, and the uncertain legacy each would leave behind. This correspondence reveals, with extraordinary intimacy, the genuine philosophical differences that had always existed between the two men even at the height of their friendship, differences that the passage of time and the softening effects of old age allowed them finally to discuss with mutual respect rather than political animosity. Adams, ever the skeptic regarding human nature and ever wary of the dangers of unchecked popular power, continued to press Jefferson on what he viewed as an excessive optimism in Jefferson's democratic faith, while Jefferson continued to gently push back against what he regarded as Adams's overly cautious, occasionally aristocratic-leaning suspicions of popular government. Yet beneath these persistent philosophical disagreements ran a deepening current of genuine mutual affection and an evident, mutual recognition that whatever their differences, they remained bound together by the singular, irreplaceable experience of having helped bring a new nation into existence, two of the last surviving members of an extraordinary generation of founders, watching together, from the vantage point of advanced old age, as the country they had created continued to grow, change, and confront new challenges entirely of its own. Adams, in these later years, also engaged in extensive reflection upon his own historical legacy, a subject that had genuinely preoccupied him since his youth, and that took on added urgency as he watched, with some private bitterness, the gradual elevation of certain founders, Washington most prominently, and increasingly Jefferson himself, to a kind of singular, almost mythic public veneration that Adams felt obscured the far more complicated, contested, and collaborative reality of the founding period as he himself had lived and experienced it. He worried, in his letters and in occasional published writings during these years, that history would remember the Revolution as the achievement of a small handful of singularly heroic individuals, when Adams understood, from his own intimate, decades-long experience of the period, that independence had been the product of countless individuals, of difficult compromise, of patient committee work and unglamorous administrative labor, as much as of soaring oratory and dramatic battlefield heroics. There is, in these reflections, a discernible undertone of genuine anxiety that his own substantial contributions, the relentless committee work in the Continental Congress, the difficult diplomatic labors in Europe, the constitutional theorizing, the political courage of his presidency, might be diminished or forgotten altogether in the simplified, mythologized national memory that was already, even in his own lifetime, beginning to take shape around the figures of the founding generation. Adams's later years also brought him the considerable satisfaction of watching his eldest son, John Quincy Adams, the boy who had accompanied him across a dangerous wartime Atlantic and absorbed an extraordinary early education in European diplomacy, rise through a series of increasingly distinguished positions, including service as a senator, as a notably skilled diplomat in his own right, and ultimately as Secretary of State, a career that would, in 1824, culminate in John Quincy Adams's own election to the presidency, an achievement that brought the aging John Adams immense and openly expressed pride, the singular satisfaction of seeing his own son ascend to the very office he himself had once held, the first instance in American history of a presidential son following his father into that highest office. By the mid-1820s, John Adams, now well into his 90s, had become one of the last living links to the founding generation, a figure of genuine national reverence whose continued presence in Quincy was understood by his contemporaries as a kind of living connection to the founding era itself. Even as his physical strength gradually failed him, his hands trembling, his eyesight and hearing diminished, and his once vigorous frame increasingly confined to his chair and his bed. Yet his mind, by all surviving accounts from visitors and family members during these final years, remained remarkably sharp, engaged, and characteristically opinionated almost to the very end, and his correspondence with Jefferson continued, letter by letter, as the two old patriots, separated by hundreds of miles but bound by their shared and singular experience, approached together the natural close of their extraordinarily consequential lives. As 1826 approached, anticipation began to build across the United States for an occasion of profound national significance. The 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, a milestone that would fall on the 4th of July of that year, a date that carried for John Adams, more than for almost any other living American, an entire lifetime of meaning compressed into a single recurring point on the calendar. It was the date, of course, on which Congress had formally adopted the document that Adams had fought so fiercely to bring into being, the document whose drafting committee he had served upon, whose passage he had championed on the floor of Congress in oratory Jefferson himself had called the most powerful of the entire independence debate, and whose principles he had spent the better part of 6 decades defending, refining, and attempting, however imperfectly, to translate into the durable institutions of an actual functioning government. As the anniversary drew near, the town of Quincy, recognizing that its most distinguished citizen, now 90 years old and increasingly frail, would almost certainly be unable to attend the planned public celebrations, asked Adams to provide a toast or a brief written sentiment that could be read aloud at the town's official Independence Day commemoration in his stead. Adams, by this point largely confined to his bed and weakened considerably by the accumulated infirmities of advanced age, dictated a response of characteristic brevity and conviction. Asked for a toast, he offered simply, "Independence forever." When pressed by those attending him for some additional words to accompany this declaration, he indicated, with the same unadorned directness that had characterized his entire public life, that he had nothing more to add in the pre-dawn hours of July 4th, 1826, as the nation outside his window began to stir into its 50th anniversary celebrations, with church bells ringing, cannons firing salutes, and orators across the country preparing to deliver commemorative addresses celebrating the Revolution and its surviving architects. John Adams lay dying in his bed at Peacefield. Those gathered at his bedside, including family members who had remained close through these final difficult days, would later recount that Adams, drifting in and out of consciousness as the day wore on, spoke his final words sometime in the afternoon. According to the most widely repeated and historically resonant account, his last coherent utterance was a brief, characteristically generous tribute to the old friend with whom he had shared so much, both the triumph and the bitter estrangement and the eventual, treasured reconciliation of their final years. Thomas Jefferson survives, or words very near to that effect, depending upon which family account one credits most fully. John Adams died later that same afternoon, on the 4th of July, 1826, at the age of 90, exactly 50 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence had been formally adopted by the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. What Adams could not have known, what no one gathered at his bedside in Quincy could possibly have known on that singular afternoon, was that his final words, however precisely they were actually spoken, carried within them a tragic and almost unbearably poignant irony. Several hundred miles to the south, at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson, himself 83 years old and gravely ill, had died earlier that same day. In the early afternoon hours, after extracting from his own physicians and family a fervent, anxious hope that he might live to see the dawn of the 50th anniversary before passing. Jefferson's wish had been granted by the narrowest of margins. He died having witnessed the arrival of the sacred date, but hours before John Adams, in Massachusetts, breathed his own last breath, entirely unaware that the friend whose survival he had affirmed with his final words had, in fact, already preceded him in death by some several hours. The extraordinary coincidence of these two deaths, the passing of two of the Declaration of Independence's most consequential architects on the precise 50th anniversary of its adoption, struck the American public, when news of the dual tragedy reached the country in the days that followed, with a force that bordered on the providential. Newspapers across the nation, eulogists in pulpits and public squares from Massachusetts to Georgia, and ordinary citizens reflecting on the news in their private correspondence, struggled to interpret what seemed to many an almost impossible alignment of historical timing as anything other than a kind of divine punctuation mark upon the entire revolutionary generation's achievement, as though Providence itself had arranged for two of the Revolution's most important surviving voices to be called home together at the precise moment that completed exactly half a century of the nation's independent existence. Daniel Webster, delivering one of the most celebrated eulogies commemorating the two men's joint passing, captured something of this sentiment when he reflected upon the singular strangeness and fitness of their simultaneous deaths, suggesting that history itself seemed to have arranged the timing as a final, unrepeatable testament to the bond between these two founders and the cause to which they had devoted their lives. In assessing, from the distance of history, the full arc of John Adams's extraordinary life and career, one finds a figure who resists easy categorization, who fits comfortably into neither the uncomplicated heroic mold that popular memory often prefers to impose upon the founding generation, nor into any simple narrative of villainy or failure that his genuine and significant flaws might otherwise invite. He was, across more than 5 decades of public life, an indispensable architect of American independence in the most literal and consequential sense. The constitutional theorist whose careful reasoning helped frame the colonial case against parliamentary overreach in the earliest days of resistance. The defense attorney whose insistence on a fair trial for British soldiers demonstrated, at real personal cost, that the American cause was rooted in genuine justice rather than mob vengeance. The relentless committee man whose administrative labors helped sustain Washington's army and organize a navy when the revolutionary cause hung by the thinnest of threads. The forceful orator whose advocacy on the floor of Congress helped carry the vote for independence itself. the patient diplomat whose persistence secured Dutch recognition and Dutch gold when American finances stood on the brink of collapse, and one of the three commissioners whose skillful negotiations secured a peace remarkably favorable to a young and vulnerable nation. Yet he was, in equal and honest measure, a man of genuine and consequential flaws, a president whose tolerance of the Alien and Sedition Acts compromised, however briefly, the very liberties of expression the revolution had been fought to secure, a political figure whose blunt, often tactless manner and whose stubborn insistence on his own carefully reasoned positions, even when those positions cut against the political winds of the moment, repeatedly undermined his own popularity and his own historical standing relative to more naturally charismatic contemporaries. A man whose genuine anxieties about unchecked popular power sometimes shaded into a wariness of democracy itself that sat uneasily alongside his own deep and sincere Republican convictions, and a figure whose all-consuming ambition for historical distinction, candidly documented across a lifetime of diary entries, existed in permanent and unresolved tension with his equally genuine, equally documented love for the quiet domestic life with Abigail and their children that his decades of public service so often and so painfully denied him. It is precisely this complexity, this fundamentally human combination of genuine principle and genuine vanity, of real courage and real stubbornness, of profound intellectual achievement and recurring political clumsiness, that makes John Adams, perhaps more than any other figure of the founding generation, a peculiarly accessible and instructive subject for historical reflection. He was not a marble statue of unblemished civic virtue in the manner that popular memory has sometimes preferred to render Washington, nor was he possessed of Jefferson's effortless eloquence and enduring popular mystique. He was, instead, a man of fierce intelligence and fiercer conviction, perpetually self-aware of his own shortcomings even as he struggled, often unsuccessfully, to master them. A man who poured his entire adult life, at extraordinary personal cost to his health, his finances, and his cherished family relationships, into the difficult, unglamorous, and frequently thankless labor of actually building the institutions and securing the international standing that gave substance to the soaring promises of 1776. The nation that John Adams helped bring into being would, in the decades and centuries following his death, grow far beyond anything he could have fully anticipated from his vantage point in Quincy, expanding across a continent, surviving a catastrophic civil war that would test, in ways even Adams's own anxious political philosophy had anticipated, the fundamental question of whether a government founded upon the principle that all men are created equal could ultimately extend that promise to all its people, and enduring across 2.5 centuries as one of the world's most consequential and influential experiments in Republican self-governance. That this nation survived its perilous infancy at all, that it weathered the immense uncertainties of its first decades, the weakness of the Articles of Confederation, the bitter partisan warfare of its earliest contested elections, the genuine threat of war with the great powers of Europe, owes an incalculable debt to the patient, often unglamorous, frequently unpopular labor of men like John Adams, men whose contributions rarely produced the kind of singular, dramatic moment that popular memory tends to celebrate, but whose accumulated decades of principled, difficult, consequential service quietly built the foundation upon which everything that followed would ultimately rest. He died as he had lived, stubborn to the last, devoted to the last, his final thoughts turned toward the old friend and fellow architect of independence with whom his name and his legacy would remain forever and inextricably intertwined. John Adams, farmer's son, country lawyer, revolutionary, diplomat, and president, had lived to see the improbable cause to which he devoted his life endure for half a century, a cause whose ultimate fate, on that symbolic 4th of July in 1826, still remained, as it does in every generation, unfinished and unfolding, entrusted now to the hands of those who would come after him.